When the only tool in your tool belt is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If prison is the only option that we have for treating crime, then every solution looks like incarceration. Prison reform is a movement that has recurred periodically throughout history, but so far every reform has failed. If prisons are overcrowded, you have two options: either build more prisons or reduce the number of prisoners. So far, the only thing we've done is build more prisons, and the system just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Instead of reform, we have just fed the prison industrial complex more and more people. Currently, the criminal justice system just works to remove the problem people from society, which really turns out to be people of color, the homeless, and the poor. If we truly want to reform the way that we treat people who break the law, we need to think about the ultimate goals of a criminal justice system. I believe that we need to stop looking at crime as if it's only a bunch of individual problems. Rather than treating criminals individually, we need to look at the bigger picture. Rather than thinking that a criminal is a person who has failed society, maybe we need to start thinking that it's society that has failed them. In my video on principles of punishment, I mentioned that some systems are starting to experiment with a concept called restorative justice. This approach seeks to increase the involvement of community stakeholders, as well as actually addressing survivors' rights in the judicial process. The overall goal is to repair harm and restore balance to the community. Restorative justice processes are not perfect though, and there are some legitimate critiques. One concern is that it implies that there is actually something to restore, when it might be that the conditions prior to some violent act are not something that you actually want to return to. One organization, called Generation 5, takes similar principles to restorative justice, but focuses on actually changing our communities into safer, healthier places. They call it transformative justice. Generation 5 has chosen to focus their efforts on the problem of child sexual abuse, and their goal is to eliminate child sexual abuse within 5 generations. The key goals behind transformative justice are survivor safety, offender accountability and transformation, community response, and transformation of community and social conditions that create and perpetuate harm. In order to transform how we prevent crime and manage harm, we have to stop treating all crime with just one solution. The first step to finding an alternative to incarceration is to recognize that we can't just replace the prison industrial complex with one system that is the exact same size as the prison system. Any solution to this problem must be varied and nuanced. Right now, we only treat the symptoms of crime and not the causes. We need to shift our focus to reducing poverty, improving education and access to education, providing adequate health care, and generally treating people with respect. Our justice system should be based on reparation and reconciliation, not on vengeance and retribution. If we are concerned about drugs and drug crime, let's rethink what those concerns actually are and how we address those concerns. Ultimately, we are concerned about the negative health and psychological effects that drugs can have, but by criminalizing the possession and use of drugs, we are not actually helping the people with those problems. If we want to prevent addiction and overdosing, we have to treat drugs like a health problem, not a criminal one. Locking addicts behind bars will not help them. Creating a black market only leads to further violence and pushes addicts into the dark, rather than providing them a pathway out of addiction. For drug addicts who want to manage their addiction, going to some kind of rehab program is often only an option if you have a lot of money. So we see Hollywood stars disappear off to rehab for a couple of months, but if you're poor, you go to jail. Instead of spending so much money on policing and incarcerating drug users, we should offer community support programs. If a person wants to stop using drugs, a program should be available to them regardless of their personal financial situation. By actually treating the health and social problems that drugs can cause, we can begin to create better communities. Many people ask what you do with violent criminals if you can't put them in prison. There isn't an easy answer, but it is pretty clear that prison doesn't actually solve anything. Victims and survivors do not get anything out of that process, and as we have already seen, prisons only cause more harm. It is also important to remember that violence is often a side effect of other acts like drug use or property crimes. Addressing one will also affect the other. But there are pure acts of violence. Violence against women is an all too common example of this. Unfortunately, our society has an epidemic of violence against women that is usually hidden and tolerated. Many people who commit violent acts against women are never held accountable. Transformative justice principles can help to actually hold people accountable while also providing safety and healing for the woman who has suffered so much harm. Building community support systems to help women get out of violent situations is critical. Once a woman is out of a violent environment, reparations and healing can begin. Also, helping people to control themselves so they do not harm others will actually reduce violence. Locking them behind bars won't. In my video about harm in prisons, I mentioned that more and more immigrants are being incarcerated. Immigration is a big topic in the United States and a difficult one, but fear of immigrants has been a constant throughout our history. What should be clear, though, is that locking people up whose only crime is crossing the border without proper papers is not only inhumane, but does not actually solve the problem. As Americans, we pride ourselves on how great our country is. We should not begrudge other people who just want to share in that. Some organizations have made an active effort to use restorative justice principles to reduce or repair harm. Restorative Justice Community Action in Minnesota actively engages people in community conferences to talk about harm. Although RJCA works largely within the existing criminal justice system, the space that they create is new for most people. These public open discussions provide the opportunity for healing and reparations. Critical Resistance is a national movement that focuses more on harm reduction. CR recognizes that most offenders are oppressed people, and although they do commit harm, this must be viewed against the backdrop of the violence and destruction caused by the prison-industrial complex. Local chapters of CR use demonstrations, lobbying, and direct action to accomplish goals like putting a stop to prison building or providing community support networks for incarcerated people. There is still a lot of work to do to reduce and repair harm in our country, but there are people actively working toward that goal. The prison industrial complex has become so huge that it is going to take a lot of time and effort to dismantle it and find better solutions to our problems. Locking people up in prison is easy. Healing is hard, but it's worth it. Thank you for taking the time to watch the videos in this series. I hope that the questions I've been asking will go with you so that you can talk about them with other people. I'd also like to give a big thanks to my professor, Dean Spade, and all of the authors and activists that have inspired me.